Hi, I'm Susan. Welcome to my home and studio at Windy Acre Cottage. It's a 100-year-old craftsman cottage where I love to paint and garden and entertain and care for all my wonderful fur babies, both those that are adopted and all the little fosters. It's also my home base for many fun adventures of the art, history, and gardening kind. Hi, I'm Susan Elizabeth Jones, and today we're going to be painting with watercolor. And it's not always fun, but the first thing you have to do when preparing to paint with watercolor is to prepare your paper. You have to pre-stretch paper. And if you think about it, what happens when you have a wet spill? You get paper to sop it up. Water is absorbed by paper. And what happens to that paper? It will expand. So it's only logical to think that if you're painting in watercolor on paper, that paper is going to absorb that water and the paper is going to grow. So we have to pre-block the paper. We have to expand it by getting it wet and then blocking it on wood and then letting it dry in that stretched position to try to keep that paper from getting really wonky. So I'm going to start with some cold pressed watercolor paper. And this comes in a tablet. You can get it at the art supply store. I know they've got it at Walmart. They probably have it at Target and maybe Michael's and Hobby Lobby. And a lot of times, if you can, this is not attached to anything except up here. If you can find the kind that is gummed on all four sides, a lot of times it's already pre-stretched. And as long as you don't remove the gum, you can go ahead and paint on it. And then when it dries completely, you take a razor or an X-Acto knife and then cut the paper off of that pre-gummed block and you're good to go. But if you're just using loose paper like this, you want to go ahead and take it out of the tablet. And then what I like to do is cut it down to the size that I want it to be. Now, I always paint small with watercolor. I was trained to paint small. I don't know why I never paint big, but I usually paint 5x7 or even smaller. So, and this is not even that big. This is, I believe this is 11x15 paper, but there's paper that I buy online that's called Imperial size, and it's like 22x30 inches. It's much less expensive to buy in bulk that way, but you have to cut your paper down. So what I've got here are two ways of cutting the paper down. I have this little Fisker paper cutter that I can measure out 7.5 inches, which is halfway, and cut that in half. Or I also have another board that I like even better, and it's a self-healing mat, a ruler, and an X-Acto knife. And you line those up. And I'm going to do 5.5 inches. And the reason why I like this one better is because you have more control over where your cut goes. On these things right here, they're a little wonky. So you line that up, you put your razor right on the edge, and you cut. And it's perfectly 5.5 by 7.5. Now, why did I cut it to that size? Because 5 by 7 is a standard frame size, but I want to cut it 5.5 by 7.5 because when we block it, it's going to expand, and then we're going to have to use tape to block it down, and we're going to come in 1/4 of an inch. So we have created not only our 5 by 7, but we've also created what I would call a 1/4 inch selvage, and I know that's a term come from sewing. So your seam allowance is a selvage or seam allowance that we allow on the edges to be covered by that tape. So what I usually do is I go ahead and cut out these 5.5 by 7.5 all day long. I don't just block one piece at a time. I do a ton of them at one time, and then they're all ready when I'm ready to go. So you take your paper, and I usually do this in the sink in the kitchen. If you're gonna do a really big piece of paper, it would have to be in the bathtub. That's another reason why I don't like to paint big. It just gets more difficult to block paper the bigger it is. But you wanna put it in the water and submerge it. It'll float a little bit, but you wanna leave it there for 5 to 10 minutes. And I used to think it just took like a minute or two, but really and truly, if you want it to absorb as much water as possible, it does take about 5 minutes. So we're gonna let that sit here. And if I was going to be blocking more paper, I would just throw in more. And you want there to be water in between the paper, so you don't wanna just mush it down there, but you'd let that sit for a little bit, and then you'd get your next one and put it in here. And I'll do a dozen at one time, and then walk away and do other things. And then I'll come back and then we'll block it. So hang with me, and we'll come back here in a minute and I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes, and so what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull that paper out of the water, let it drip a little bit, and then what I'll do is take 2 fingers and run it through those fingers and try to get out as much water as I can into the sink before I even put it on my mounting board. Now, the mounting board can be wood, or it can be this masonite that is covered in white dry erase board. These come in 4 by 8 foot sheets at your local DIY shop, Home Depot, Lowe's. And what I do, and they're only like $10 or $12, and I go ahead and have them cut in 1 by 1 foot boards. I do this because I go ahead and put together a dozen at one time. I also teach classes. I used to have a nice, beautiful, big piece of wood that I would block my water paper on, but it's so heavy. I can't imagine trying to teach a class with a dozen students and trying to carry these big chunky pieces of wood that have the paper on that. This is the perfect size. So I've got, and notice I'm gonna do it on the white side that's kind of got a surface to it, a real slick surface. You do not want to do it on this side. Believe me, I made a mistake and I put it on this side, and the glue in the masonite glued the paper to the board. It would not come off. So I had to use a jigsaw and cut the paper out onto the board so it was permanently attached to the board and could be framed that way. But I reuse these boards, and like I said, an 8 by 4 foot sheet is like $10, so you're gonna get, what is that, 80 of these out of there if you do 1 by 1 foot. So we're gonna lay our wet paper on this board, and then I'm going to take just a dish towel and start in the middle and start pressing that paper out. I'm trying to get the water off, but I'm also trying to enlarge the paper. So we're starting in the middle and we're pressing it out in all directions, drying the paper, but also stretching the paper. You want to get it as stretched as possible. Okay, now you can use freezer tape, which looks like a craft tape. That is highly recommended. You can use the blue painter's tape, or you can use regular masking tape. They all have their pros and cons. And one thing I love about the blue tape is that when you go to take it off after you finish your painting, it won't tear your paper. So that's why I like the blue tape. The only problem with the blue tape is if your paper is wet, which it is still, it doesn't stick as well. So we're gonna pull off some tape. I'm gonna lay it on the edge to line it up and then come in 1/4 of an inch. And I'm gonna do that all the way around. I'm gonna kind of eyeball it here, lining it up, and then pull it over 1/4 of an inch and stick it down. Line it up, and then go in 1/4 of an inch and stick it down. Line it up, move it in 1/4 of an inch, and stick it down. So now there's going to be a white edge all the way around my paper once I paint on it and then remove the tape. Now, what some people like to do is they have the 1/4 inch on 3 sides, but then they'll move the bottom one up a whole inch. And then when they remove the tape, there's still gonna be a 1/4 inch between the end of the painting and where the frame begins. And that is where they'll sign their name, or they might put the name of the painting, they might put the date, they might put a Bible verse, they may put a favorite quote or a favorite line from a poem. Whatever they want to do to embellish their painting, they'll leave that space at the bottom. I don't typically do that, but that is an option as well. Why do we do this? The reason why we do this is because when it absorbs the water from your watercolor, it's not going to absorb the water evenly because your paper's not going to be wet all over. It's only going to be wet where the paint goes. And so that's where the absorption is going to happen. So as it absorbs in that one area, it'll expand in that one area where everything else is dry and flat. And that wet absorbed area is going to blossom and create a ripple. And if you don't pre-stretch your canvas and keep it pasted down in the stretched position, it'll just get all wonky. Now, it'll still do that a little bit when it's pre-stretched, but not nearly as much. So this will always be the best way to go. Now, I'm using cold pressed paper, and it will be more forgiving than hot pressed paper. And there's hot pressed, and then what's called not pressed. And not pressed is cold pressed. It's got a thicker tooth. It's got more texture to it. It will make a more painterly painting when it's all said and done. And it's really much better and recommended for beginners. So when you go to the store, go ahead and get the cold pressed paper is what you want to start with. Now, even among the cold pressed paper, they're going to run the gambit from being fairly nubby to being really thick and nubby. And so it's just a matter of preference. But the thicker and nubbier it is, the more forgiving it is. If you get the hot pressed paper, it's going to be like copy paper. It's going to be really smooth, it's going to be really thin, and it's going to wrinkle more. It's going to show mistakes more. I was taught that you couldn't undo a mistake in watercolor, and that probably is true with hot pressed paper, but we've got several things we're going to learn how to do with the cold pressed paper that I think you're going to like. So this is the end of lesson 1. You want to go ahead and prepare your paper so next week we can get started with painting. Thanks for joining me today.